Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy and dive into the darkness. The old Langwood Manor had been the setting for countless weddings over the years. But among the tales of love and celebration, one story stood apart, a chilling tale whispered through generations, the story of the ghostly bride. Langwood Manor was once a grand estate, its sprawling gardens and gilded halls the envy of the town. However, the manor's beauty masked a dark secret. Many spoke of the tragic wedding day that forever stained its history. It was the late 19th century when Eleanor Whitmore, a young woman of grace and charm, was set to marry Jonathan Harker, a wealthy businessman. Eleanor was beloved by all, her laughter a melody that could brighten even the darkest corners of Langwood. The manor was her family's home, and her wedding was to be the event of the season. On the day of the wedding, the manor was alive with excitement. Guests in elegant attire filled the halls, and the scent of roses wafted through the air. Eleanor, dressed in a gown of ivory silk, looked ethereal as she prepared in her room. But as the hour drew near, something shifted. Eleanor's maid found her sitting by the window, gazing out at the gardens with an expression of deep sadness. "Are you all right, Miss Eleanor?" the maid asked. Eleanor turned to her with tear-filled eyes. "I feel as though I'm being watched," she whispered. The maid dismissed it as pre-wedding nerves, but Eleanor's unease lingered. As the ceremony began, the guests rose to their feet, the orchestra playing a soft tune. Eleanor appeared at the top of the grand staircase, but something was wrong. Her face was pale, her steps hesitant. As she descended, her gaze fixed on a spot near the back of the room. Those who noticed followed her line of sight, but saw nothing. To Eleanor, however, the figure was clear, a shadowy man in tattered clothing, his face obscured but his presence palpable. Despite her fear, Eleanor continued. She reached the altar and took Jonathan's hand. The priest began the vows, but Eleanor's focus wavered. The shadowy figure moved closer, and she felt the air grow colder. When the priest asked if she would take Jonathan as her husband, Eleanor hesitated. Before she could answer, the room plunged into darkness. The candles flickered out, and a chilling scream pierced the silence. When the lights returned, Eleanor was gone. The guests searched frantically, calling her name. Hours passed, and then days. She had vanished without a trace. Some speculated she had fled, overcome by the pressure of the wedding. Others whispered of foul play. But Jonathan, devastated and guilt-ridden, refused to leave the manor, spending his days searching for any sign of her. Months later, a gardener found her veil near the old well at the edge of the property. Inside the well, they discovered her body, still dressed in her wedding gown. The coroner's report was inconclusive, but rumors spread that Eleanor had been pushed, or worse, lured there by an unseen force. After Eleanor's death, strange occurrences began at Langwood Manor. Guests reported hearing soft weeping in the halls, and some claimed to see a bride-like figure wandering the gardens at dusk. The sightings became so frequent that the manor earned a reputation as a haunted place. Couples who wed there often left with stories of ghostly whispers and flickering lights. One chilling account came from a photographer hired for a wedding decades later. As he developed the photos, he noticed a figure standing in the background of several images. The figure wore a wedding dress, her face blurred as if caught in motion. The photographer, shaken, swore never to return to Langwood. Over time, the manor fell into disrepair. It became a site for thrill seekers and ghost hunters, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghostly bride. Many claimed to hear her soft footsteps echoing through the empty halls, or saw her shadow flit past windows. Some even reported feeling a cold hand brush against them. One particularly terrifying encounter involved a group of teenagers who broke into the manor on a dare. They wandered the halls, laughing nervously and calling out to Eleanor's spirit. As they reached the grand staircase, they heard a faint melody, the same song played during her wedding. The laughter stopped as the temperature plummeted. Then, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs, a woman in a tattered wedding gown, her face obscured by a veil. She raised a hand, pointing at them, and let out a bone-chilling scream. The teens fled, swearing they would never return. Years passed, and the manor's reputation grew darker. Paranormal investigators arrived with advanced equipment, hoping to document the haunting. Recordings captured whispers, faint sobbing, and a chilling voice saying, "Where is he?" The investigators unearthed old diaries belonging to Eleanor, which hinted at a secret romance before her engagement to Jonathan. The entries spoke of a stable boy named Thomas, whom she had loved deeply but had been forbidden to see. Some speculated that Thomas was the shadowy figure she had seen on her wedding day, his spirit seeking vengeance or closure. Local folklore added to the mystery. Some claimed the well at the edge of the property was cursed, a place where the heartbroken had taken their lives for centuries. Others believed the manor itself was a magnet for tragedy, built on land soaked with sorrow. A particularly harrowing account came from a caretaker who had stayed at the manor to oversee renovations. He reported being awoken in the middle of the night by the sound of heavy footsteps. As he rose to investigate, the air grew icy, and he saw a faint glow emanating from the ballroom. Peering inside, he witnessed a spectral wedding reenactment, ghostly figures dancing in silence, with Eleanor at the center, her face etched with despair. The caretaker left the next morning, abandoning his post and warning the renovators never to return. Despite the fear, some visitors to Langwood Manor spoke of a sense of sadness rather than terror. They described encounters with Eleanor's spirit as melancholic, a grieving bride trapped in an endless loop of heartbreak. A psychic who visited the manor claimed Eleanor's spirit was tethered to the property by unresolved emotions, a longing for closure that kept her from moving on. One daring couple decided to hold their wedding at Langwood Manor, drawn by its Gothic allure and ghostly legend. As the ceremony unfolded, the bride began to feel an inexplicable chill. During the reception, the groom's grandmother, a woman known for her sharp intuition, approached the couple and said, "She's watching. She's happy for you, but she's so very lonely." The cryptic remark sent shivers through the guests, and the couple later reported hearing soft weeping that night, as if Eleanor herself had blessed their union. The legend of the ghostly bride endures, a chilling reminder of love lost and the weight of unfulfilled promises. Langwood Manor stands as a testament to the power of grief and the mysteries that linger long after death. To this day, those who visit leave with stories of their own, forever marked by the haunting presence of Eleanor Whitmore, the bride who never had her happily ever after. It was the kind of night that whispered unease into the very air. A heavy, damp fog clung to the streets, blotting out the stars and moon. The road ahead stretched endlessly, swallowed up by darkness. Mark had just finished his late shift at the gas station and was eager to head home. He lived in a small town in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods and quiet, isolated stretches of highway. The only thing keeping him awake on the long, monotonous drive was the faint hum of his old car's engine and the radio playing an old rock station. The silence of the night seemed too thick, too suffocating. It was one of those nights where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, as though something was waiting for him. Mark tried to push the feeling away, shaking his head. He was being silly. It was just a regular drive home. Nothing more, nothing less. But as he continued down the narrow highway, something caught his eye in the distance. A figure. A lone person, standing by the side of the road, their hand raised as if trying to hitch a ride. A hitchhiker. Mark blinked in disbelief. The last thing he expected to see out here in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, was someone looking for a ride. It wasn't like there were many cars on the road at this hour. The person, a young woman, appeared to be dressed in an elegant white gown, her hair cascading in soft waves over her shoulders. She stood eerily still, her face hidden in the darkness, but Mark could sense something unsettling about her posture, almost unnatural, as though she were waiting for something. His heart rate quickened as he slowed the car, unsure of whether to stop or keep going. The logical side of him screamed that it was unsafe to pick up a stranger, especially at this hour. But the other side, the part that couldn't ignore the lonely figure out there in the mist, urged him to stop. As the car rolled to a stop, Mark's headlights illuminated the woman, revealing her pale face. Her features were delicate, and her eyes, though full of sadness, had an otherworldly intensity. He could see the faint tremor in her hands as she gripped the edge of her gown, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth. She didn't seem to notice him right away, her gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. "Need a ride?" Mark asked, his voice breaking the silence that hung between them. The woman's head snapped toward him, her eyes locking with his in an instant. There was something eerily hollow about her stare. She didn't speak at first, just stared at him for a long moment, as if studying him. Then, in a soft voice that sent a chill down his spine, she answered, "Yes. Please, I need to get home." Mark nodded, though something inside him felt deeply uneasy. "Where are you headed?" "Just a little further down the road," she replied, her voice almost too soft to hear, like a whisper in the wind. Mark tried not to let his discomfort show as he unlocked the passenger door. The woman slid into the seat next to him with grace, her white gown flowing around her like mist. The smell of her perfume was intoxicating, floral and sweet, but with an underlying scent of decay, like something long forgotten. As they drove, Mark tried to make small talk to break the eerie silence. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice uncertain. She smiled faintly, but didn't answer. It wasn't that she ignored the question. She simply didn't respond at all. It was as though she hadn't heard him. The more he tried to engage her, the more distant she became. She stared blankly out the window, her fingers nervously twisting a ring on her finger. It was strange. There was something wrong about her, something that made Mark's gut tighten with every mile they passed. The fog thickened, and the headlights barely cut through the dense haze, making it difficult to see the road ahead. The night felt oppressive, suffocating. Every few moments, Mark would glance at her, but she remained still, her eyes locked on the horizon. "I'm almost there," she murmured, her voice a low whisper. Mark glanced at her, surprised. "Where exactly is that?" he asked, trying to hide his growing sense of unease. "The old house on the hill," she replied, her voice a ghostly whisper, sending a shiver down his spine. Mark had heard stories about the house. It had been abandoned for years, rumored to be cursed. People in town said it was haunted. No one dared to go near it. Mark's heart raced as the fog grew thicker, the road narrowing and winding into a dense stretch of woods. He didn't know why he didn't turn back, why he didn't just stop and tell her to get out. But the strange pull she had over him, the desperate look in her eyes, kept him going. "Are you sure?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The house has been abandoned for a long time." The woman turned to look at him, her eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite place, something cold and unsettling. "I'm sure," she said softly. "It's the only place I can go." Mark felt his throat tighten as the car continued to wind through the woods. The night seemed to grow darker, the air colder. Then, out of nowhere, the woman spoke again, her voice now hauntingly distant. I was supposed to meet someone there." Mark glanced at her, trying to keep his composure. "Who?" he asked, though he feared the answer. She didn't reply. Instead, she just stared ahead, her lips parted in a strange, almost painful smile. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating. Mark's palms were clammy on the wheel, and his heart raced as they reached the top of the hill. The fog seemed to part just enough for him to see the silhouette of the old house looming ahead. It was every bit as terrifying as the rumors had suggested, dark, crumbling, and surrounded by twisted trees. Mark slowed the car, his eyes glued to the road ahead, unwilling to look at the woman beside him. His mind screamed at him to turn back, to leave, to not get any closer to the house. But his body was frozen. He couldn't make himself move. He felt as though he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As the car came to a stop in front of the house, the woman slowly opened the door, her movements eerily smooth. She glanced back at him with an unreadable expression. "Thank you for the ride," she whispered before stepping out of the car. Mark watched her walk toward the house, her gown trailing behind her like a ghostly veil. The fog swallowed her whole before she even reached the front door. He blinked in disbelief. One moment, she was there, and the next, she was gone, vanished. Panic surged through Mark as he slammed the car into reverse, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the silence closing in on him. He sped away, not daring to look back. The road felt longer now, the darkness pressing in on all sides. His hands shook on the wheel as he drove, his mind racing. The woman, the strange feeling she had given him, it didn't make sense. She had been so real. But when he passed the old house, there was no sign of her. Nothing. As he approached the edge of the town, Mark decided to stop by the local diner to calm his nerves. He needed to talk to someone, anyone, about what had just happened. When he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled, drawing the attention of the waitress. She smiled at him, but there was something odd in her gaze. "Rough night?" she asked. Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. I just gave a hitchhiker a ride," he said. "She was on the road near the old house on the hill." The waitress froze, her smile faltering. "What did you say?" "The old house on the hill," Mark repeated. "That's where she said she was going." The waitress took a step back, her face turning pale. You picked up a hitchhiker?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark nodded. "Yeah, she was wearing a white gown. She vanished when I dropped her off." The waitress's face went completely white. "That's impossible. She's been dead for years." Mark stared at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" "The woman you picked up was the girl who died in an accident on that road many years ago," she said quietly. "She's been haunting that road ever since, waiting for someone to take her home." Mark felt his blood run cold as the full weight of what had just happened crashed over him. He had unknowingly given a ride to a ghost, the vanishing hitchhiker. The diner was silent, the weight of the story hanging in the air like a thick fog. Mark knew that his life would never be the same again. The nightmare he had lived was only the beginning. It was a quiet evening when James returned home from work. The air was cool, and a soft wind rustled the leaves outside his window. It had been a long, exhausting day, and he was looking forward to a quiet night, alone with his thoughts. He lived in a small house on the edge of town, far from the busy streets and noise of the city. The isolation was something he enjoyed, until that night. James pulled into his driveway, the headlights of his car casting long shadows across the yard. As he stepped out of the car, he noticed something strange near his front door, a figure standing in the dim light, just beyond the porch. At first, he thought it was a neighbor or maybe a delivery person, but as he walked closer, the figure didn't move. "Hello," James called out, his voice a mix of curiosity and caution. The figure remained still, just standing there in the darkness. As he got closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was a child, no more than 10 years old, standing at the foot of his porch. But something was off. The child was dressed in ragged clothes, pale skin, and seemed oddly out of place in the quiet suburban neighborhood. Their face, however, was what made James's blood run cold. The child's eyes were completely black, no pupils, no whites, just deep, empty pools of darkness. The pupils seemed to swallow any light that touched them, creating an overwhelming sense of dread that gnawed at James's gut. He took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. The child didn't respond. It just stood there, staring at him with those hollow, soulless eyes. The wind seemed to die, and the night grew eerily silent. The child's presence was unnerving, as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. "Do you need help?" James's voice was barely above a whisper, the fear creeping into his tone. He knew something wasn't right, but he couldn't bring himself to turn away. The child took a step forward, slowly, deliberately, its feet making no sound as they brushed against the ground. James's instinct screamed at him to run, but he stood frozen in place, unable to move, his body paralyzed with a mixture of fear and confusion. The child's lips finally parted, and in a voice that was unnervingly calm, it spoke. "Let us in," the child said. James's breath caught in his throat. There was something chilling about the simplicity of the request. The voice wasn't like any child's voice he had ever heard. It was hollow, unnatural, as if it came from somewhere deep within the earth. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and he instinctively took a step back. "What would you want?" James asked, his voice now trembling. His eyes darted around, looking for anyone that could explain what was happening. "Let us in," the child repeated, its voice more insistent this time. The way it spoke sent a wave of terror through him. There was no emotion, no warmth, just a cold command that seemed to echo in his ears. James wanted to slam the door shut and lock himself inside. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stay away. But there was something about the child's presence that kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't move, couldn't think straight. Something about this felt wrong. Why? James asked, though he knew he shouldn't have. He was trying to reason with something that shouldn't exist. But the question escaped before he could stop himself. The child's black eyes seemed to grow darker, and its lips curled into a faint, sinister smile. "We just want to come inside," it said again, but this time there was an edge to the voice, a threatening undertone that sent chills crawling up James's spine. A sudden flash of clarity hit him. He had heard stories about creatures like this, the black-eyed children. There were rumors that they appeared at people's doors, asking to be let in, but no one ever spoke of what happened if he did. Those who had encountered them spoke of the overwhelming sense of dread that accompanied their visit. They never seemed to age, and their black eyes were an unmistakable mark of something evil. Some said they were demons. Others said they were souls trapped between worlds. But one thing was certain: they were never good news. The child took another step forward, its black eyes glinting with something almost malicious. James could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears now, his breath shallow and erratic. He didn't know what to do. He was terrified, and yet there was a part of him that felt a strange compulsion to obey. Before he could even react, another figure appeared behind the first, the unmistakable shape of another child, with the same pale skin and pitch-black eyes. Then another, and another, until there were 4 of them, standing silently in the yard, their hollow gazes fixed on him. "Let us in," the children chorused in unison, their voices blending together like a single entity. The temperature seemed to drop around him, and he could see his breath in the air. He felt the weight of their gaze pressing down on him, and every instinct in his body told him to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there. But he couldn't move. One of the children, this one a girl with long, tangled hair, took a step closer. "Please," she said softly, her voice almost pleading. "We're cold. We need to come inside." James's body trembled with fear. The air around him was thick, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The children's eyes were like deep voids, pulling him in, making him feel as if he was being suffocated by their presence. He could feel the darkness seeping into his thoughts, clouding his judgment. "Please," the girl repeated, her voice almost sweet, but with an undercurrent of something darker. James shook his head, his lips dry, his mind racing. He had to get away from them. He had to find a way to break free from their grip. But as his hand moved toward the door, ready to slam it shut, he heard a voice deep within his mind. Not his own, but something far older, far more ancient. "Let them in. You can't escape them. They will find you," the voice echoed, reverberating through his skull. He recoiled, the words wrapping around him like chains, holding him in place. The children's smiles widened, their black eyes gleaming with anticipation. James suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to obey, to give in to their demands. His body moved against his will, his hand shaking as he reached for the doorknob. But before he could open the door, he heard a loud crash from behind him. The front door swung open, and the children's smiles disappeared. Their faces twisted into snarls, their black eyes flickering with rage. A strange pressure in the air intensified, like something was about to snap. In that moment, the spell was broken. With every ounce of strength, James bolted forward, shoving the door shut behind him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The sound of scratching, of frantic whispers, echoed from the other side, as if the children were trying to claw their way in. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He ran. He ran like his life depended on it. Because it did. The terror that surged through him was primal, raw, and as he sprinted down the hallway toward the back door, he could hear them behind him, their voices echoing in the silence, calling out his name. "Let us in." But James never stopped, not until he reached the safety of his car. He never spoke of what happened that night. No one would have believed him. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw those black-eyed children staring back at him with their hollow gaze. And every night, he could still hear them, whispering at his door, "Let us in,